And I think oftentimes the exhaustive divine determinists only look at God's omnipotence. And, sometimes maybe others are just worried about his omniscience. So I say, well, we got to look at both of them, 100% of both, and factor them in all the time. So anyway, it comes down to the question, does an omnipotent God have the power to create a creature with the ability to choose between or among a range of alternative options that are each compatible with the creature's image of God nature at a given moment?
Okay, so the first premise of this version of the argument, and there are other versions of this same sort of argument, but the first premise of this version says, God believed 1,000 years ago that I would raise my hand at T. So let's let T abbreviate sometime, maybe 5 minutes from now. So if God exists, and if God has exhaustive foreknowledge, then he existed 1,000 years ago. And if in fact I'm going to raise my hand at T, then it turns out that God believed 1,000 years ago that I would raise my hand at T. So that's the first claim. The second premise, and this is where things do get a little bit more complicated, but we'll walk through it slowly. The second claim says, if one is true, that is, God believed that I'd raise my hand at T. He believed that 1,000 years ago. And I'm free not to raise my hand at T. In other words, I have free will with respect to my raising my hand. Then it's in my power to do something such that were I to do it, either God would have had at least one different belief 1,000 years ago, or two, God would have had at least one false belief 1,000 years ago. And the basic idea here is, imagine what it would take for me to have this power to refrain from raising my hand. It seems like what I would have to be able to do is make it such that God didn't have the correct belief about what would happen in the future, or that God just had a different belief. That's basically what this says. So my freedom to do otherwise than raise my hand at T would require one of these two things, God having a different belief or having a false belief. But then the third premise says neither of those things are in my power. So more technically, it's not in my power to do something such that were I to do it, God would have had at least one different belief 1,000 years ago, or God would have had at least one false belief 1,000 years ago. So if those things aren't in my power, then it follows, given that God believed 1,000 years ago that I'd raise my hand at T, I'm not free not to raise my hand at T. In other words, I raise my hand at T, but not freely. I don't have.
So we'll stop it there, and we'll leave this up on the screen for people as we comment. One thing that seems to me, and I know you're going to get into this and unpack this more and make some of the premises stronger, but just a real quick thought I had, and I hope this doesn't derail the points too much. It seems to me we could just add to premise 2 a third option, which is I have an ability, but one that I would never freely choose to do.
Yeah, I like that.
But anyway, so you had some points to make about this.
Yeah, it's a very interesting syllogism, and I had to read through it a couple times just to make sure. Or actually, when I was running, I took a quick break and hit the rewind button, listened to it again, and started running again. But a couple things. I guess the first thing that I'd like to do is just make the first premise even stronger. And so let's call it star 1. I just say that logically prior to God's creative decree or act of creation, God knew that Sally would freely raise her hand at T, even if God never created Sally in freedom or in a freedom permitting circumstance. So even if God never created Sally, even if God never created a freedom permitting circumstance, even if God never created anything, God knows, an omniscient God knows how Sally would, if he created Sally in a freedom permitting circumstance, that Sally would either raise her hand or not. God knows this. So that's the first thing I do, is just strengthen the first premise. And then I'd add that if God freely chooses to create free Sally in this freedom permitting circumstance, again, which an omnipotent God would possess the power to do, then of course an omniscient God would know how Sally would and will freely choose 1,000 years ago, or 1,000 days ago, or 1,000 seconds ago, or 5 seconds ago, it doesn't matter. So anyway, we can unpack that a bit more. But with that said, I can affirm premise 1 and premise 2 of the syllogism. However, the Molinist can reject premise 3, it seems to me, and thus reject the conclusion. Now, of course, we reject the last part of it, where he says that God would have had at least one false belief 1,000 years ago. So that's just false. Because a maximally great being, by definition, if we're talking about God and the definition of God being a maximally great being, then a maximally great being, by definition, never possesses a false belief or affirms a false belief. We can always conceive of a being who affirms one more true belief, right? So,
Yeah.
So anyway, a maximally great being never possesses a false belief and never affirms a false belief. But be that as it may, the Molinist can affirm that Sally possesses the freedom, the ability, and the power to act in such a way that God would have had a different belief than how Sally would freely choose 1,000 years ago. Even, and this is true even logically prior to God's creative decree and creative act. So it really comes down to the question, does God have the power to create a creature with the ability to choose between a range of alternative options, each of which are compatible with the creature's nature at a given moment? So it really comes down to that question. So, he brought up omniscience, but I'd say, well, we got to bring in all the omni attributes here, and at least omnipotence as well. And I spend a lot of time on this in my book. I discuss what I call the big three of God's omni attributes and what follows from this. I even bring in God's omnibenevolence, but I don't think we need to bring in that right now. Let's just focus on omnipotence and omniscience. And I think oftentimes the exhaustive divine determinists only look at God's omnipotence. And, sometimes maybe others are just worried about his omniscience. So I say, well, we got to look at both of them, 100% of both, and factor them in all the time. So anyway, it comes down to the question, does an omnipotent God have the power to create a creature with the ability to choose between or among a range of alternative options that are each compatible with the creature's image of God nature at a given moment? So with that said, there's something else that we've got to point out. So let's suppose that I'm wrong about what I just said. Even if that were the case, if Sally did not possess the ability to do otherwise, in this case, the ability to refrain from her hand raising, for some, like I said earlier, for some weird reason, it does not follow that Sally did not raise her hand in the libertarian sense, right? Like I said before, as long as she is the source of her hand raising and nothing else causally determines Sally to raise her hand, then Sally is free in the libertarian sense. But be that as it may, I still think Sally's free and has the ability to do otherwise. I still think Sally's got that kind of freedom, and we'll talk about that more. But I just want to point out that she's still free in a libertarian sense, even if I'm wrong about that.